Yes, you read that title correctly. I am building all of Breath of the Wild in Minecraft. Back in January, I embarked on this massive journey, and after uploading part 1 in March, you guys loved it. In the last episode, we imported the bare bones map of Hyrule into Minecraft and finished up the entirety of the Great Plateau, so you can go and watch part 1 if you wish to catch up. Looking at the map of Hyrule, this outlined region shows everything we did in the last episode. In this video, I want to finish all of this, so it's definitely much more work this time around. After reading through all of your comments on the last video, I decided that it would be best to build Kakariko and Hateno Village in this episode, along with their respective regions. A lot of you guys were also telling me to implement some sort of mod that adds features from Breath of the Wild into my map. But unfortunately, I have to tell you guys, I don't know anything about Breath of the Wild mods, I can't make any mods myself, so I don't think I can really do that. But luckily, I have a friend who can.
My name is Hauziki, and I've been recreating features from Breath of the Wild in Minecraft using commands. I post videos on my YouTube channel that are essentially problem-solving story time. I think of a feature I want to add and we work out which core Minecraft mechanics to exploit using commands until we achieve a good-looking and fun-to-use result. Now, here's a sneak peek of the video that's coming out next. And remember, this uses 0 mods.
That's right everyone, me and Hauziki have officially teamed up to make the ultimate Breath of the Wild map. I build the map, he makes the data pack. Lots of you guys were asking for this, and I'm so excited to finally be able to reveal it to you guys. His channel is linked in the description. I recommend you go and subscribe because I will not be spoiling everything he does in my videos. You can keep up with his side of the project there. But now, it's time to get back on track. Let's get started on this episode of Breath of the Wild in Minecraft. Allow me to bring you guys back to March, right after I released part 1. In part 1, I mentioned in a few offhand comments that I was having issues properly scaling everything. And this is when it becomes apparent that the Temple of Time is way too big for this scale. At the time, I thought nothing of it and told myself that the map did not need to be at the perfect scale, which I still believe. But this minor issue manifested into a pretty catastrophic mistake. When I began to scout out the region that I would be building in for part 2, the issue became clear immediately upon reaching the site of the 2 villages. Oh, this is where Kakariko Village is? Oh no. There's not enough room here, is there? Oh no. I have to upscale the map, don't I? I have to upscale the whole map. That means I have to redo everything. I have to redo everything. That's right, the map was too small. As you can see from this screenshot, this was the valley that Kakariko Village would be located in. I knew, looking at this, that there was not enough room to fill an entire town in. So I'm sure you might be wondering, how did this happen? How did I make such a mistake? Well, the whole issue dates back to when I first made the map. If you recall, in episode 1, I used World Painter to create the map, which is basically an application that allows you to paint your own Minecraft worlds. I imported a height map of Breath of the Wild into the software to get the bare bones map. The map would be about 4,096 blocks on all sides when I imported it into Minecraft. But in World Painter, I could scale this up to be any size I wanted. So what would be the best size for the Breath of the Wild map? Well, the Breath of the Wild map is estimated to be 10 by 8 kilometers, and since every Minecraft block is a single meter wide, the map should be about 10,000 by 8,000 blocks. So I'm sure you're wondering, how is this the issue? How did this lead to the mistake I spoke of? Well, because of the size of the height map I was using, my map had to be a perfect square. I couldn't stretch one side longer than the other. This meant that I essentially had to choose between one of the 2 dimensions. I could either go with the bigger scale, closer to 10,000 by 10,000, or the smaller one, around 8,000. Out of fear of going too big with the project, I decided to go with the smaller scale. I had underestimated the size of the Breath of the Wild map, leading to this mistake. So what's the solution? How do I fix the scaling issue? The answer is quite simple. I have to restart the entire project. This time around, I picked a scale closer to 10,000 by 10,000 blocks since 8,000 was too small. This would still give relative accuracy to the size of the Breath of the Wild map. I also made the map taller the second time as well. On the first map, the highest point only reached 256 blocks, but in the new one, it reaches 512. Before long, I had the new world in Minecraft, and I flew around a bit and verified that the scale would work. But of course, we still have to rebuild the entirety of the Great Plateau from episode 1. Luckily, I didn't have to rebuild everything. Some of my builds from part 1 still worked on this new scale, such as the Temple of Time. So using Minecraft's hidden structure block, I was able to transfer the builds over to the new world and simply paste them in. I began to rebuild the plateau very slowly, but at this point I was not very motivated to continue with the project. Episode 1 was not doing very well at this point, and just having to restart really took a toll on my motivation to continue, so I kinda just stopped for a while. That is, until June rolled around and part 1 completely blew up. Your guys' support on episode 1 gave me the motivation I needed to continue with this project, so seriously, if it wasn't for you guys, there probably wouldn't be a part 2. Since it had been 2 months since I had uploaded part 1, I decided to skip past the Great Plateau for now and move on with the project. And with all that finally out of the way, we can get into all of the building in this episode. Looking at the region that I want to complete in this episode, we have a lot of important landmarks to cover. Straight outside the Great Plateau is our first destination, the Outpost Ruins. Instead of skipping straight to the 2 main villages, I wanted to build my way there from the Great Plateau. So for now, let's focus on making our way to the Dueling Peaks. Beneath the unfinished Great Plateau, I pasted in the first forest in the Kingdom of Hyrule. At this point, I still did not have a good method for putting in all the trees and forest floor, so you can kind of see me struggling to do so. But soon after, I would find a much better way to implement the forests. Beside the forests are the long-forgotten ruins of an old outpost. I implemented the first 2 flag poles and a bit of a broken path, making sure that the flags all blow in the same direction. Moving further down the path, I began to mark out all of these ruins, and here is where I learned that Breath of the Wild has a lot of reused assets. A lot of these buildings that I make right here in these ruins are pasted all across the Breath of the Wild map, which I'm actually thankful for because that means I have to do less building. I might end up introducing some of my own designs into the mix just so that when the world download eventually comes out, it's a bit more interesting for you guys to explore. A little bit out of the way is a smaller portion of the ruins as well, with a building pasted in from the greater structure. I also built the first stone talus, which is located on a hill near the ruins. Lots of you guys were telling me that I forgot to build the one on the Great Plateau, and I didn't necessarily forget, but on the old scale, I just didn't have enough room for it. But I will for sure be adding it into the new map. Originally, I thought the stone talus looked really goofy, and I was gonna redo it, but at this point, I have grown so sentimentally attached to him that I don't think I can bring myself to redo it. Even further down the path was the first shrine that most players go to after leaving the plateau, along with some more ruins. I went for the same strategy here, using the map in Breath of the Wild to mark out where all of the structures would be, before coming back later to fill them all in with buildings. After finishing these ruins, we were pretty much already almost done with this small portion of the map. And that's the sort of good thing about moving on from the plateau. Although the plateau took forever to finish, it was a lot more dense and had a lot more stuff jam-packed into it. But in reality, a lot of the Breath of the Wild map is pretty empty. As you can see in this clip, the last thing I really had to do in this region was put in a bunch of tall grass, ferns, and flowers to really make it seem more finished. Further down the road is the first of many bridges we would have to build in this episode. I'm actually really happy with how this bridge turned out. It was pretty simple, but I don't know, I just really like the way it looks. Building bridges quickly became one of my favorite things to do in this map. I don't know, I just like building the bridges, and there were some pretty cool designs that I had to transfer to Minecraft later on. And with the bridge finished, we were on to the second half of the road to the Dueling Peaks. After crossing the bridge, the Dueling Peaks were in sight, and there was not much in this region that we had to even finish up. After prettying up the cliffs with some stone, I began to paste in small details like a ruined guardian and some enemy camps. Along the shore here, you could see me make quite a big one before I move on to the Great Tree Stump. There's a large felled tree in this region that kind of has fallen down the hill, and there's a bit of a Korok seed related to it. It was actually pretty fun to make, and it turned out a lot better than the one we made in episode 1. In these wide shots, you can see I begin to paste in some of the trees, making a large forest closer to the mountain. I also added in some more small details like those random green towers you find all around the map, and put in place a small campsite beneath it. After that, all that was left was to add in all of the grass, ferns, and flowers again, always going to be the finishing touch when I close off a region. Now, it didn't feel quite right moving on to the Dueling Peaks without this small region of land complete. There's a bit of an island north of the road we were just building, and I wanted to finish up that entire region first. After putting in some of the basic details, I got to work implementing all of the bridges that connected to this chunk of land. The first bridge was pretty fun to make. It was a pretty interesting design at a bit of an angle, so it was kind of difficult, but not so bad. It was the second one where things started to get hard. This second bridge was a diagonal one, which put a bit of extra difficulty on it, but it wasn't actually that bad. Really, it was actually quite fun to try to bring this design into Minecraft. The third bridge, however, took quite a while to finish. It was pretty much a duplicate of the one we just built, but it was a lot bigger and it was at a different angle, so I couldn't just reuse the same bridge. Despite the difficulties of this bridge, it was quite fun to make, and it ended up looking pretty cool. Those 3 bridges on their own took 3 hours to make, so I think you guys can start to understand why this video took so long. With the island properly connected to the rest of the world, I put in all of the trees. Again, it's getting a bit repetitive, but it needs to be done. And at this point, I had streamlined the process and found a much easier way to put in all of the trees. After that, I got to work putting in the final details. There were a few skull camps around the area, and a giant diving board onto concrete for some reason. Like, seriously, what are these things? But there was also this random training camp thing, which I think has some sort of Korok seed with a horse, if I recall. After that, there were just some final touches to add in, the grass, the flowers, there were some smaller trees I had to put in, and some stuff in the forest. With the island finally out of the way, we were able to move on to the Dueling Peaks, and of course, that introduced a massive problem. You see, because I imported the world through a height map, it didn't actually make any of the overhangs around the map. So the Dueling Peaks looked like this, really bad, which meant I had to terraform them manually. I started by filling up the random holes that the mountain decided to form for some reason. You'll see when I'm filling up the holes that I used sand for this, and that's because sand actually falls. So when you place spheres of sand in the sky, it ends up falling and looks more natural than if I use something like stone. I then moved down to the bottom to make the little ledges that have the shrine on them, which were pretty easy because I was just able to use sand again. After that, I moved on to the cliffs further up, which were a lot harder to make. Because the Dueling Peaks have a lot of overhangs, I couldn't simply use the sand trick. Or could I? As you see in this clip, I used the same strategy using sand to basically make a bunch of custom terrain, and then I flipped it upside down to make the overhangs. That way, I get the very natural look without having to terraform it completely by hand. I forgot to record some parts of this because I'm a doofus, but you could see me using the sand trick here. I also pasted in the shrines at the top and the one at the bottom before adding in the camps and other stuff that's between the 2 mountains. With the Dueling Peaks done, we are now getting so close to building Kakariko Village. But first, I needed to build the battlefield outside Fort Hittano. This is the area where you find the final memory. I laid out all of the ruins and the bokoblin camps before pasting in all of the dead guardians surrounding the region. I also added some drip leaves and lily pads to the water to make it feel more swampy. And we also get to build our first stable, which I'm sure many of you guys are excited to see. The stable on its own was not very challenging until I got to the horse head. It's just a simple spherical building. You can also see that I went for a blue color with the roof. In-game, it is kind of a dull bluish color, and I tried to replicate that here, but it doesn't really look that good. So for these clips, it does have a blue roof, but I ended up going back later and changing it to a darker color. Moving up to the top is the giant horse head that sticks off the roof, which was quite the challenge to make. You could see a lot of trial and error going into this. It was pretty fun though, I gotta admit. I'm really happy with how the horse head itself turned out. Moving on inside, I finished up the interior as well, messing around with the roof coloring a bit, but I eventually got it in the end. Moving back out, this is what the finished stable looks like, before the roof change, of course. Zooming back across to the other end of the battlefield, I decided to build up Fort Hittano while I was here. I actually built this on stream and it was a ton of fun to make. Ruining the walls and then building in the repairs that were made years later was so much fun, and you can see I even built in the forest and the cabin behind it. And after that, I pasted in the massive amount of dead guardians that were in front of the wall. And in one last wide shot of the region, you can see me putting in all the grass and flowers. Yet again, there is some other stuff that I built in this region behind me, but it's just really a forest. There's nothing that important to show. Just a little bit further to Kakariko Village. I continued along the road by making the bridge north of the stable, which was a duplicate of a bridge we previously built, but it was at a different angle, so I had to pretty much rebuild the whole thing. This is also the one with the giant rock that's just sticking into it for some reason, and before you guys ask, yes, I did put the secret camp underneath the bridge. The rest of the road to Kakariko Village was pretty empty. There was pretty much nothing there, except Hestu. I did build Hestu, as you can see. Very lovely. But now we made it. We have made it to the highlight of the episode. Let's get on with building all of Kakariko Village in Minecraft. To begin, I had to pretty up the surrounding landscape where the village would be. I began by getting rid of all the snow, and you can kind of see it keeps flashing to white. I was moving around a lot, so I keep going out of render distance. Apologies for that. As you can see, I quickly turned it all to grass and stone. I also added some moss tips to each of these little pillar mountain thingies because the top of them are very grassy in Breath of the Wild. Jumping back into the valley, you can see I have a lot more room for buildings in this new map than the old one. I first laid out Impa's house on the little pedestal thing before I moved on to the rest of the buildings. Some of these shapes and sizes would change over time as I actually got around to building the houses. For the buildings, I decided to start with Impa's house. It was so much fun to come up with. I just had a lot of fun with Kakariko Village in general. This house especially had a very unique design and was pretty much unlike any other house I've built before, so it was really interesting to make. You can also see coming up here that I have some special Sheikah Eye banners that I implement into the build. Now this design is not mine. I did change the color slightly, but I found this design online. I couldn't find the original artist to credit, but I will link the post that I found about it in the description. The roof for this building was really interesting to make, especially with the little weird bar things at the top. With Impa's house out of the way, I had started to work on the two general stores on the south side of the village. These buildings were very strange to make, mostly because of the odd roof designs. I've just never made any roofs like this in Minecraft before. But I think it's great that this video is giving me all kinds of new designs to work with and try out. And this is when I realized that pretty much all of the buildings in Kakariko Village are identical. There's like two unique designs and they're just copy and pasted around the village. There was only a couple other buildings I had to make, as you can see in these shots here, but for the most part I was just copying around the same two designs. Which, it is a bit unfortunate that a lot of them are just the same building, but it's accurate to what it is in Breath of the Wild. Heading down the middle of the village, you could see me put in some of the paths, the little stream and pond. I even put in the mini goddess statue before I finally terraformed the waterfall behind Impa's house. After all the buildings were complete, I backtracked to make these little gate entrances to the village. I think they're called Tori, but I'm not too sure on that. They're located at each of the entrances of the village, but they're all identical to each other. Then I finally moved on to the interiors. I'm not going to show them all, but I'll show you guys Impa's house, the general store, and the little Cucco cabin. You guys will be able to explore the rest of them when the world download eventually comes out. To finish off Kakariko Village, I pasted in all of the trees and began to add in some of the smaller details, such as the bridges, the farmland, the little deck by one of the general stores. There are also a lot of these odd hanging strings all over the place, so I added those using nether brick fence and oak slabs. And with all the final touches in place, Kakariko Village was finished. But of course, we still have to fill in the area around Kakariko Village. As you can see here, I put in the forest above the village with the Great Fairy Fountain. The fountain was actually not that bad to build. Of course, I made it in its opened, blooming state. It was only a little annoying to get the angle of the petals right, and it was a bit of a small scale, so it was hard to be perfect with, but I personally think the Great Fairy Fountain turned out pretty good looking. Of course, I couldn't actually build a Great Fairy, though. That would be too hard. I'm not that good. And as you can see from this wide shot, I'm finishing up adding in all the grass, the ferns, the flowers. You could see the forest with the shrine in it. This whole area with Kakariko Village at the bottom just looks great, I think. I'm patting myself on the back this one time. It looks fantastic. But wait, don't click off yet. If you recall, I said I want to build 2 villages in this episode. We still have to make our way to Hateno Village and build that. I might have been a bit too ambitious with this episode. So let's go all the way back to Fort Hittano and move past it to continue along the road to Hateno Village. This single wide shot shows everything we have left to build in this episode. It looks like a lot, but a lot of this is just empty terrain, so there's really not that much. Some of you guys who really know the Breath of the Wild map might have realized that there's no giant overhang behind Fort Hittano. Well, as I mentioned earlier with the Dueling Peaks, the map didn't really load any overhanging areas very well. But there's actually a large overhanging rock structure here, and I had to build it manually. Unfortunately though, I couldn't do some sneaky tactic like I did with the Dueling Peaks. I did have to do some manual terraforming. In this clip, I turned off the shaders because it was hard to see what I was doing underneath, but with night vision, it's very clear. And at the end, you see I change it to stone, and I puncture some big holes in the top that are there in the game. After I finished the cliffs, I began to put in all of the trees in the region, including the stone talus above the custom cliffs. And soon enough, I moved on to the little horse camp thingy. In the valley beneath the tower, there is a sort of horse riding camp thingy, and you shoot targets to get a Korok seed, I think? I don't know, I just build things. Believe it or not, but that's pretty much everything in this region apart from the village. Of course, there were some camps and other small things I added in, but there's just not enough time in this video to go over every small detail I added. For example, I did put this shrine back in this corner with the statue and the glowing eyes. So if you're getting ready to comment saying you missed this, don't worry, I probably did get it. So, let's move on to Hateno Village. Just like with Kakariko Village, I began by getting rid of all the snow on the mountaintops and changing all the stone to grass to give it a nice pretty look. This village was different from Kakariko in the sense that a lot more of the buildings were diagonal and there were a lot more unique buildings. Granted, there were still a lot that I was just going to have to copy and paste around because, again, Breath of the Wild tends to reuse assets like this. But this village has more unique building designs than Kakariko Village did. As you can see, I moved straight onto one of the most common designs in the village, building up the general store that you usually go to when you first reach the village. Sandstone I found to be the best match for the colors in the village. And as you can see, I also used brick for the roofs, which I think is the only time I've ever used brick, because it just doesn't usually look that good, but it matched the roof color closest. I also built in that random little tower that's there for some reason that has absolutely nothing in it, before moving over to the dye shop. The interior would wait for later, but as you can see, I used stained glass to mimic the potions or the dyes that he has hanging up in front of the building. Right across the road is another pretty basic building, and the building next to it was also completely identical to it, so I just had to build up one of these and paste it in literally right next to each other. They didn't even bother to, flip the building so it doesn't look exactly the same. And there was also the armor shop here, which wasn't too bad to build up. The armor shop design would actually be one of the most common designs in the whole village. I then moved on to the Terrytown style homes, which I struggled with a little at first, but by making them bigger, I was able to improve the design. But these buildings are bound to look bad in Minecraft, because usually you don't want to make your buildings just giant cubes, but that's basically all the Terrytown houses are. But they turned out a lot better than I expected them to. In the background, you'll also see me paste in Link's house, which was just another reused asset from earlier in the village. Closer to the entrance of the building were another 2 buildings that were just reused from earlier in the village, so I was able to simply paste these ones in. Heading to the back of the village, I pasted in a few more buildings and got to work on the Windmills. At first I tried a design that was much more accurate to what it is in Breath of the Wild, but I didn't really like how it looked, so I changed it a bit. You can see on the new ones, I made it at a different angle so that it actually looks like it's spinning around, you know? Then there are 2 more large buildings in the village which are completely unique and not reused anywhere else in the game. This first one is the one that has the goddess statue in it and the weird tower, and it was actually pretty fun to come up with this design. Right next to it is the inn, which was at a very odd angle, so it was a bit of a challenge to build, but it was actually kind of fun. The roof design was a bit different from the rest of the village, but it didn't really take any time at all. And to finish it off, I implemented the deck that the inn has. Finally, there was one more small building up the hill, which is reused from earlier at the village, but I had to rebuild it at a different angle. With that, all of the buildings were complete, minus the tech lab, of course, we'll get to that soon. So I moved back to the entrance of the village to put in the gate at the front, and added in all of the paths that go throughout the village. I began to implement these little farm thingies with sweetberry bushes and spruce leaves. But in this wide shot, you'll see I put in all of the larger farms as well. I didn't fill up the fields entirely because I thought it might look weird, but looking at it now, I might go back and fill them all up. I also made the ancient furnace, which honestly I don't like how it turned out. It's not really easy to make on this scale, but it'll do the job for now. Back over at Link's house, I also had to build the little bridge that goes over the river, and yes, before you ask, I did put in the horned statue, I just didn't show it here in these clips. I also added in the other smaller details that are around Link's house. I put in all of the trees in this region, including the forest up by the tech lab, along with some smaller bushes around the village. And after that, I got to work on all of the interiors. Again, we don't have time to go through every single interior, but I'll show you guys some of my favorites here. But with the interiors done, there was only one more build we had left to do, the Hittano Ancient Tech Lab. Don't behead me for this, but I might have forgotten to hit record when I first started working on the tech lab. But as you can see, I didn't get very far before I noticed I just built up the little entrance thingy and pasted in the tower. I put in the giant telescope as well, which I guess they used to spy on Hateno Village. I didn't even know it was there until I started building this. A small detail I noticed while building this that I love as well, the little room that Pura added to the top has a roof like the Kakariko Village roofs. I just love that small little detail, I don't know, I just felt like sharing it with you guys. And I moved on inside to make the interior as well. I did my best to make it look very messy. I added in little white carpet to make it look like papers were thrown about everywhere. But after the interior was done, there was only one last step before this build was finished. Zooming back out, I put in all the grass and ferns and everything in this region, including all the little flowers as well. And that finishes off all of the building we had for episode 2. And here we are. We finally finished everything that I wanted to do in this episode. It took a few months, but as you can see, we have finished from all the way to the Great Plateau, down the road to the Dueling Peaks, and far off in the distance you can kind of see Hateno Village all the way over there. This is a mod that I added to my game called Distant Horizons, which basically increases your render distance using LODs, so it doesn't take much of a toll on your computer or anything. So as you can see, the render distance is really high, but when you zoom in, the detail tends to, drop. I'm really happy with what we finished in today's episode, because not only did we finish the 2 villages I wanted to, but it's properly connected to the Great Plateau and everything. Coming on down into Kakariko Village. Unfortunately, this mod is not compatible with shaders, but I think it's pretty cool to look around regardless. As you can see, I've added in all the little small details around the place. We have finished a lot in today's episode, but when you look at the whole map, we really haven't made too big of a dent. Next episode, I hope to make my way a little bit north to finish up Zora's Domain, the Divine Beast in that region, but I also kind of want to finish off the Faron region in the bottom right. So if you don't want to miss part 3 when we do some of that stuff, I recommend you guys subscribe because, of course I would. Episode 3 should not take as long as episode 2 because although it's been 4 months since episode 1, only about 2 of those months was I actually working on the project. And remember to subscribe to Howziki as well, as he is going to be making my map functional. Thank you guys all for watching this episode, and especially on part 1. All the new people here, I'm so happy to have you guys, and I just can't wait to get part 3 out. But I might be uploading a video or 2 before part 3 comes out, so you guys will have to look out for that. So for now, I'll see you guys later.